now my pleasure to introduce our next moderator, who will then take on this first session. It is my pleasure to introduce you Mr. Marcelo Caetano, who is the Secretary General of International Social Security Association. Mr. Marcelo, please, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, George, and thank you very much for being here at this event. So we are now beginning the first session, the session 1, who deals on the challenges for the extension of social protection to workers in the informal economy and also good practice. So with each time I make the questions, each speaker have 5 minutes to answer it. I will tell you when it's missing 1 minute to close the question. So my first question goes to Mr. Grégoire Hovana. He is the Minister of Labor and Social Security in Cameroon. So thank you very much for being here with us today. So my question is, in Cameroon, workers in the informal economy represent nearly 90% of the working population and have for long been excluded from the general social security system. To improve this situation, the government set up in 2014 the voluntary insurance system managed by the National Social Security Fund. Honorable Minister, could you briefly present the system, the results achieved so far, and share the main challenge encountered for a greater coverage of workers in the informal economy? So, Minister, please.
Merci de nous donner la parole.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. The Regional Director of the ILO, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, everybody connected to this meeting, all participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. The system of voluntary insurance in Cameroon is a quite simple system that covers old age pension, invalidity, and death, intending that officers are covered for their social security system. And this system covers workers for the informal system, and it is run by the CNPS, the National Social Security Fund. The non-coverage of risks is covered by other branches. So to be short, I am going to stop with these results obtained and the challenges. The results obtained up to now, we have had over 200,000 volunteers. And the results involves more than 1 billion local francs. And the challenges and the problems set, especially concerning the adaptation of this coverage to the real needs of the populations, that are many. Populations do not have the same constraints nor the same economic situations as because the informal world of workers is not involved in contribution because the system is contributive. And so this makes so that informal workers participate very little to this type of voluntary insurance due to their ideas related to long-term contributions and systems. Obviously, they prefer short-term benefits, in particular as far as healthcare is concerned, or as far as their family is concerned. So studies are made in order to see how to integrate populations, and the perspective are those of the labor market. Of course, there is an informal part of the market that is very large, very important, is about 80% of the active population evolves in the informal world. And this population is very vast for a country that nowadays has more than 25 million inhabitants. So there is a rural world that is very active. And all this world has an income enabling them to continue working in this sense. So what we need is a change in perspective, a change in mentality that will mark a difference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. So now I'm making the question to Sabelo Mubukazi, who is the African Union representative. The African Union has adopted the Social Protection Plan for the Informal Economy and Rural Workers, Aspire Worker, in 2011 to support member states in the extension of Social Security. Could you please present the main components of this plan, the result achieved so far, the challenge in its implementation, and the prospects for the next few years? So please, Sabelo.
Okay, so I think I hope you can hear me from your end, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, I can.
And we would like to thank you very much for yes, in addressing the question, which is a key question upon which most of the discussion will be aligned this afternoon. Challenges for extension of social protection to workers in informal economy and good practices. Yes, indeed, the African Union Commission came up with the African Union Social Protection Plan for informal economy and rural workers, which is popularly known as the Spire Work. The Spire Work, which is a plan focusing specifically on economy for rural workers, particularly the informal economy on a plan that then drives the work that we are doing at the African Union with the AU member states to drive the improvement of conditions and social protection around the informal sector. And of course, the key components that we work with the political leaders so that there is accountability and good governance. And then the second component will be youth and women so that we can promote women employment. And the second component will be the social protection and productivity for sustainable and inclusive growth. This is in line with even Agenda 2063, Aspiration 1, which is and sustainable development. Then the second point will be well-functioning and inclusive labor market institutions. And around this area, we are developing annually the statistics on labor migration so that we can understand the labor market institutions and so that the policies that are developed around by data, they're informed by evidence. The second component will be the well-functioning and inclusive, or that is rather, the next one will be labor migration and regional economic integration. It is important as we work even within the tripartite arrangement that there is an understanding across the board of labor migration, and so that even when when in issues of cross-border and the movement of labor and skills, it's even possible to be able to recognize the work in this sector. The last one will be partnerships and resource mobilization. The partnerships and resource mobilization is also a key component which assists even African Union to work with the CSO. Hello?
1 minute.
Conclusion.
Yeah.
1 minute. Let me draw now to the main challenge. The main challenges that we see here within the tripartite arrangement. We see that the government, the business, and trade unions, they do not include the group, the informal, and therefore they are always left behind. But the other challenges that we see in this area is child labor, and these are the areas that need to be tackled. But the other area that is important for us to pay attention to is also the casualization of employees in this area, but also is poor information base, is skills gap, is financing, and also I think I've mentioned the child labor. So these are the challenges that we see in this area. Maybe as I conclude, what is it that the African Union has done in order to be able to address these challenges? The African Union is developing a protocol, and this is a protocol that is going to focus on social protection and social security. So it's still a draft protocol on African Union, and to focus also on human rights. So it has a human rights component in it, but it's called the African Charter on Human to Social Protection and Social Security. So this is what it's happening now, so that we can address, we can extend social protection also to the informal economy. I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabelo. Well, now I give the floor to Dr. Joy Katikirava, who is the Africa Bureau Senior Strategy Advisor of the United Nations Development Program. So, Dr. Joy, UNDP is increasingly engaged in the promotion of social protection and recently published a report on informality and social protection. Could you please share the main findings of the report, UNDP regional approach, and the importance of coordination and strategic partnership for the extension of social protection in Africa? So please, Dr. Joy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Good morning from New York. It's a pleasure to join you in this important conversation. Commissioner El Fadil, AU Social Affairs, ASG Olonjuwan, Honorable Ministers, Mr. Munyaratsi, DCO, George Okuto, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to engage. I would like to make 3 points in response to your question. One is really this question of where are we on the African economy? When we talk about informality, is there something called informality, or are we really talking about what the African economy is practically? The second point is around the COVID factor. The third point is what are the models we must adopt to get us there, and then to summarize with some conclusions. So informality, we tend to talk about it as if it were an other factor. 86% of all employment generated in Africa is in the informal economy. 9 out of 10 jobs come from this sector. So I'd like to make the case that the informal economy is the African economy. And therefore, we must think about social protection as critical for SDGs, as critical for unlocking the potential of that economy, especially because when we look at what the numbers tell us on social protection, ASG Olunjuwan has clearly mentioned what that is, below 18%. They don't get access to what is available to the formal sector, neither do they get anything concrete and substantive out of the area of social assistance. And yet, in fact, in spite of all of this, they're still giving over 50% of non-agricultural GDP. And so it is in the interest of all development practitioners, it is in the interest of governments to invest in this informal economy because it is the African economy. The second point is the COVID factor. And this point has been elucidated quite clearly. If there was ever a doubt as to the urgency, I think COVID has laid bare. The world informal, the women in informal sector energizing and globalizing, WIGO, have come up with a survey where they tell us that over 70% of women in the informal sector registered zero earnings. What does that mean? That livelihoods are at a standstill. And so it is the right pressing development question. How do we ensure that this does not happen again? So the COVID factor has exacerbated, as has already been elucidated. And so what do we do in terms of models? 3 threshold questions from a policy perspective. Should the schemes be contributory or not? Should they be mandatory or not? And finally, in terms of the questions, what do you then do in terms of sectors? Should you look at them sector specific as we have in Kenya in terms of Jua Kali, for example, or should you think of a broader framework from the government? So these questions lead us then to some critical findings and recommendations, and I would like to stress them right now. The first one is that financing is critical. Even when we talk about contributory, we must remember that these are fragile. These are, players with very low productivity, and so might not be able to finance these consistent contributions. And therefore, the financing question to subsidize becomes a critical one. The second one is to ensure that you align contributory and non-contributory, because it is important to understand that some will not be able to contribute, but more so to then find out who should land in that space that should benefit from the subsidy. The third question, and I'm about to conclude, is that gender is key. When we talk about contributory, we must remember that women take on other roles, other critical roles in the social setting that might deter the capacity to consistently contribute because they're not consistently gainfully employing. And so paying attention to this is critical. The fourth point is around inclusion. Someone just made the point, the colleague from the African Union, that the design structure is critical because the informal players are not at the table. We must bring them to the table so that the outcome reflects their interests. The fifth and final point is that we must think of social protection, social assistance as enabling economic productivity so that we build the resilience that is needed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Joy. Emphasizing the aspects of the COVID, of gender, it's important things. So now I give the floor to Dr. Damaris Mujica, who is the Program Officer of the COTU Kenya and the Trustee of the Kenyan National Social Security Fund in Kenya. So Dr. Damaris, for decades, workers' organizations all over the world have been preeminently fighting for the extension of social protection coverage and defending the safeguard of acquired rights. Could you please elaborate on the role of workers' organizations in promoting social protection and share some good practice that workers' organizations have put in place to support the extension of Social Security to workers in the informal economy, as well as the lessons learned? So please, Dr. Damaris.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator, and greetings from Nairobi, Kenya. I want to acknowledge the presence of all distinguished guests in this platform, and also appreciate ILO for organizing this conversation. As mentioned earlier, it's true, and I confirm that the informal economy accounts for the largest portion of the labor force. Most of our African economies, they contribute significantly to the GDPs, yet characterized by very critical decent work deficits, particularly social protection. And there is a tendency of excluding informal economy from social protection schemes on both tax-financed and contributory institutions. And it's also protection systems, and therefore a need for us to accelerate implementation of the minimum standards relating to social protection. So what is the role of workers in promoting social protection? Our take is that trade unions and workers' organizations are a strategic partner in the promotion of social protection coverage to the informal economy. And our role mainly is on advocacy. We advocate for increased investment in social protection systems through integration into national development agendas. We also have a role of organizing the informal economy for representation, also to call for the right of social protection to all. And our last role that I can mention is on ensuring that there's good governance on established social protection institution. We do have good practices that we can share on this platform, what the workers' organization have done. And one, we've been able to advocate for recognition of social protection as a basic constitutional right and not a political privilege. We have also been able to participate in review of key legal framework so that we can include the informal economy workers. And we are also participating in support of the transition of the informal economy to formality, and mainly working with the government to, for example, simplify registration and tax administration procedures. We are supporting existing social protection institutions to develop social protection products and services that are targeted and specific to the informal economy workers. For instance, I can give an example of the Haba product that has been developed in partnership with the social partners, developed by the National Social Security Fund. We're also promoting leveraging of emerging technologies. For instance, the mobile money platforms that have penetrated mostly upon all the workers. And we are also advocating for proper coordination of the multiple social protection programs that exist in many of our African countries, but that can only happen through dialogue and consultation with the workers. So what are some of our lessons that we have learned? One is that social dialogue is a very critical element in the design and implementation of the social protection system, because this, we have learned, build trust, it increases buy-in, and therefore more informal economy workers are able to enroll and consistently participate in social protection. We are also have learned that expansion of tax-funded programs can only be successful if the government is able to meet people's expectations through social contracts. And the third lesson is that the informal economy in the continent is generally organized, and this presents a very efficient and effective entry point for us to expand social protection to the informal economy. And fourthly, there exists innovative strategies. For example, what I've mentioned, the mobile money platforms that can help us and can facilitate contribution of the informal economy workers. It is also very important that we have efficient labor market information management system, and this also supports expansion of the social protection to vulnerable groups. And our last lesson that we can share is that the COVID-19 emergency response has taught us that this is a very rare opportunity for all of us as partners to make sure that we advocate for inclusion of previously omitted groups into the informal, into the social protection system. So this is a rare opportunity for us that we cannot miss. And I want to call upon us to build better together. Thank you so much. Asanteni sana.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Damaris. So you mentioned important points like the relevance of social dialogue and also on the administrative procedures to increase the coverage. So now I give the floor to Ms. Jacqueline Mugu, who is the Executive Director of the Federation of the Kenya Employers, FQE Kenya. So, Ms. Jacqueline, informal employment represents the majority of the labor force in Africa. Extending social security to informal economy workers can highly contribute to the transition from the informal to the formal economy. How can employers' organizations contribute to the development and the implementation of the adopted mechanisms for the extension of social security to workers in the informal economy and also facilitates their transition to the formal economy? So please, Ms. Jacqueline.
Thank you, Mr. Marco. I'm representing Ms. Jacqueline Mugu, who is not able to join us for something came up this morning. My name is Stephen Obiro. I'm the head of advocacy, partnerships and communication at the Federation of Kenya Employers and Business Africa. And observing all protocol, Your Excellencies, just in the interest of time, Madam Jacqueline Mugu has given her contribution to this topic and looking at how the employers organization can contribute to the development and the implementation of the adapted mechanism for the extension of social security to workers in the informal economy. I have 4 points that I want to highlight. One, the employers organization play a very critical role and should be at the forefront in sensitizing the private sector on their role in the provision of social protection to the informal workers. We know that there are various conventions and recommendations and policy frameworks on social protection, and employers need to be aware of these frameworks, the policies and the strategies and what their role in their implementation is. The state cannot succeed in providing social coverage for all in Africa without the support and active involvement of the employers or the private sector. The other key critical role is to ensure the mobilization of the private sector to be able to invest in the social protection initiatives in the countries where they operate. We know that social protection by nature is an investment of the state in its people. The state creates an enabling environment for the private sector to operate and thrive, and the environment that is very conducive to businesses to grow and create jobs. And that is very important, particularly in Africa, where we have a growing youth bulge with many being unemployed. But on the other hand, the private sector has a critical role to play, as the state will only meet its obligation based on the revenues collected through tax. Being a social partner in the provision of social protection, the private sector has to comply with its tax obligation as it supports the state to provide the public tax-funded basic grantees in the social protection. The private sector has to also to adhere to the remittances for the contribution of social security programs, adhere to the principles of social solidarity through the pool resources to cater for the different contingencies which lead to enhanced social protection coverage and adequacy of benefits for formal and informal economy workers. Now, the other important and critical role is representing the private sector in the development and management of the social protection initiatives. The employers have to be at the table where all these discussion, the initiatives and the governance is happening. Now, the private sector has a key role in the governance of the social protection programs, whether they are tax funded or contributory in nature. private sector can also provide its core competence in ensuring efficient and effective delivery systems for social protection. When it comes to oversight of social protection institutions, the private sector, being a stakeholder and a contributor, must always be involved in the decision-making, as well as quality controls to ensure that social protection programs and funds are appropriately utilized. Representation of the private sector in decision-making and management of social protection programs gives a dimension of inclusivity, which would help in bring more acceptability of government's efforts to formalize the informal sector, and the employers' organization play this critical role. Lastly, we have to ensure that the state plays its role. Employers' organization play that critical role through the advocacy. We get the governments across Africa to do the right thing as far as social protection is concerned. And here, one key important thing we need to note that from our experience, when we talk of informal sector, and covering the informal sector workers and players, contributory schemes where they are required to contribute do not work. Governments have to make direct investments for them. So through the taxes they raise, they have to ensure that then they make that direct investment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan, for your words regarding the relevance of the representation of the private sector in these discussions. So now I give the floor to Mr. Hayford Atakufi. Mr. Hayford, he is the CEO of the National Pension Regulatory NPRA in Ghana. So, Mr. Hayford, introduced through the National Pension Act of 2008, the pension system in Ghana has a three-tier structure consisting of two mandatory schemes, tiers 1 and 2, and the voluntary scheme, tier 3, targeting especially the self-employed and also the informal sector. Could you please present the scheme for the informal economy, the results achieved so far, and tell us the main challenge encountered to extend coverage of workers in the informal economy? So please, Mr. Hayford, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcello, and good morning to distinguished guests. And thank you for the opportunity to engage. Yes, you're absolutely right. Ghana's pension system has a three-tier contributory structure, and it was introduced in 2008 to take effect from 2010. Yes, we do have two mandatory tiers, the tier 1, which is the basic national social security scheme, and then the tier 2, which is the occupational pension scheme. Now, the tier 1, even though it is mainly for the formal sector of the economy, can also enroll people from the informal sector, but on voluntary basis. The third tier is actually specifically targeted for the informal economy. It's made up of a group or a personal pension scheme. It's voluntary and it is contributory, and it's aimed at people who are self-employed in the economy. So under the third tier voluntary structure, you either join individually or you join as a group. As soon as you sign on, you have two accounts. You're provided with two accounts, a savings account and then a retirement account. The retirement account, you cannot draw down until you actually retire. But the savings account, you can draw down even from inception, except that you may pay some taxes on it. But if you draw down after 5 years, you don't pay any taxes on it at all. And it pays lump sum at the end of your contributory age, and it's a defined contribution scheme. Now, the results so far indicates that we have about 31 schemes, group and personal pension schemes that are operating across the country. The numbers are quite low for simple reason that it's voluntary. So it's very, very difficult to enforce. But we have about 2 million people who have signed on so far. The biggest achievement has been the cocoa farmers in Ghana who have been signed onto a special scheme. We have about 1.5 million people who are involved in the cocoa sector of the economy, the informal sector. And that is a big result that the informal sector pension has been able to achieve. So we have about 2 million so far on it. We do have challenges in the sense that the first one being that it's voluntary. I mean, for an economy like ours, which is typical of all other African economies, it's largely, informal. We have about 9 million workers who are in the informal sector. And to make a pension scheme for the informal sector voluntary in itself presents a huge challenge. People in that sector have low literacy, they have low and irregular income. They don't belong to associations or unions such that you can mobilize through them. You have to look for them individually, and therefore access to them and education and sensitization can be quite difficult. So the motivation for corporate trustees to penetrate into the informal sector is actually very, very low. So, and we don't have a universal mobile money platform like we have in Kenya, the M-Pesa one. So it is very, very difficult, and especially as sometimes people want early access to their funds. The outlook is very good. As regulators of the pensions industry, we have set up what we call the National Micro Pension Policy, which is helping us to drive aggressively into the informal sector with education and sensitization. We are now targeting private transport owners who are very massive in the informal sector. For us, we have a target of a 25% penetration. We also want to introduce fintech to support work in mobilization. We're working with our National Identification Authority so that it takes less time to sign people on. And as regulators, we don't take any fees for any trustee who wants to penetrate into the informal sector. We're learning. We want to collaborate with other jurisdictions who have good practices so that we can also learn from that. And the good thing is that the government has rolled out a non-contributory social protection called the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty, which is also helping. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hayford, for this very interesting experience regarding how to extend coverage for voluntary workers in the informal sector. So it's really quite interesting experience. Now I will give the floor to the Minister of Finance of Egypt, so Dr. Mohamed Maid. So thank you very, very much for being here today with us. So my question to you is, the 2018 Universal Health Insurance Law plans to progressively extend coverage to the whole Egyptian population and created a certain number of earmarked taxes allocated to the subsidiation and to the health financing. Could you please, Honorable Minister, share the process that led to the adoption of the earmarked tax and provide some guidance on how countries can increase the fiscal space for social protection, including collaboration with other ministers, including those in charge of social protection? So please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is my honor to be with you today and to discuss the Egyptian experience in expanding the fiscal space to extend the social protection coverage, and in particular, of course, the universal health insurance. And for us, when we designed the universal health insurance model, we decided to create an independent entity to be responsible for ensuring the sustainability, financial sustainability of the system. And this independent entity will be working as an insurance company, will be responsible to create the revenue, and at the same time will be responsible to buy to buy the health services from all health providers in the country and take the responsibility of ensuring people satisfaction of the services given to them. And at the same time, we said government health service providers should be dealt equally with the private sector and other providers like university hospitals provider, army hospitals providers, and all of that. When we concentrated on ensuring financial sustainability, we worked on ensuring that finance will come from three main sources. Number one, social insurance contributions. Number two is state subsidy for poor people. And number three is earmarking taxes. For number one, we ensured that the coverage will be for the whole family, which was a significant movement from the old system to the new system. The old system was ensuring only those who are employed by an employment contract, whether with the state, public sector, or private sector. The new one, no, it took the family as a unit, one unit to be covered. So those who are working, the parents or the father or the mother will be responsible to pay for the whole family. So if the father is working, he will take responsibility of the children. If his wife is not working, he will have to pay for her as well. But if she's working, he will not have to pay for her. So social insurance contributions is collected from the employed and from the employer. And the current rate is 3% paid by the employer and 1% paid by the employee. He will pay 2% for his unworking wife, and he will pay 1% for each child. This is how we collect the social insurance contribution. On the other side, the state will pay 5% of the minimum wage for each person or child who is eligible to receive the state subsidy. I give you an example. Now, the minimum wage in Egypt, which will be currently is 2,000, from 1st of July will be 2004. So if a family is classified that is poor, and the state has to pay on behalf of them, and this family is 5 people, so the state will have to pay 25% multiplied by the minimum wage. For example, now is 2,000. So the state has to pay on behalf of this family 500 per month to the entity responsible for financing the system, which I said at the beginning. So this is how the second source of financing is, which is a state subsidy to the families who are classified as unable to pay for themselves. We roughly talk about—
Minister, 1 minute, please.
Can I continue?
Yes, for sure. 1 minute for conclusion.
1 minute for me or 1 minute for—
No, 1 minute for you for conclusions, please.
No, I couldn't hear you. 1 minute?
Okay, 1 minute for your conclusions.
Okay. The third source is earmarking tax. We calculate a quarter of each £1,000 of each corporate entity in the country as a social solidarity contribution, in addition to earmarking taxes on tobacco and cigarettes and other sources, including £1 on traffic on highway by each driver. These are some of the sources and others which are earmarking tax allocated to the system. The system has been working for the third year now. It's financially sustainable, and we're going to expand it, and hopefully in a period 12 to 15 years will cover around 120 million of the Egyptian people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, really thank you very, very much, Minister. Now we have another minister with us, so we are very honored to have the minister from Uganda, who is Ms. Vesingeva Huktuna, who is Minister of Labor in Uganda. So, Minister, could you please share Uganda's experience on deliberate targeting and selection for social protection programs? So please, Minister, the floor is yours. So, okay, Minister. Perhaps he is facing some problems regarding the connections. Let's wait some seconds. Okay, let me, while I think that the minister is facing problems with his connections, let me continue by making some questions. So please be quite short, straightforward in the answers, because we have the time control. I want to make a question now to Dr. Joy in the meantime. So Dr. Joy, you mentioned the relevance, the importance of financing for the informal economy, but we would have liked to know how to manage to capture the contributions of the workers of the informal economy in the African context, knowing that this category, the informal economy workers, they escape the usual fiscal system. So we can go with you, and when the minister appears, we can go back to the minister. So please, Dr. Joy.
Thank you very much indeed for that question. I mean, the question of financing is critical. And I think that when we talk about how to capture their contribution, we have to start from the space of embracing that they are indeed evident, that they are included in the design structure. Because one of the challenges is architectural, that they're not efficiently, substantially at the table. So involving them at the table will build confidence, will get them to trust, because there are also issues around trusting of the systems. And in that space, a negotiation with them as to how it is that their contributions can be captured, so to speak, and then used to engage more in productive processes. The other point I'd like to stress on this one is the importance of ensuring that the financing arrangements touch not only on contributions per se, but on giving them financing mechanisms to engage and scale their production. One of the challenges we see from our study is that most of the challenges they face around low productivity are critical. They don't allow them to scale. And so we must not only think about how to capture what they're contributing, because remember, they come from a low productivity base. We must think of subsidization, and the subsidization with a view to widening the numbers, but also to scaling their capacity for contribution. So it's not just assistance, it's an investment in production. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, it seems that the Minister of Labor of Uganda, it seems that he's back. So, Minister, please, could you please share Uganda's experience on deliberate targeting and selection for social protection programs? So, please, Minister.
Thank you very much. I'm Martin Wandera, the Director of Labor. The Minister has stepped out to attend to another urgent matter, and he has asked me to represent him. The approach in Uganda has focused both on statutory social insurance, which mainly focuses on workers in the formal sector, as well as tax finance social benefits for formal sector workers in the public sector, and a few elderly persons aged 60 and above who receive a cash transfer from the Treasury. In the informal sector, people are not covered by the statutory contributory social insurance and tax finance benefits. However, people on their own have developed self-help community-based mechanisms which they use to secure themselves against different vulnerabilities. These schemes are not very developed. They are limited in coverage and scope, but the communities in the informal sector have faith in them because they are close to them and they are able to deal with their vulnerabilities as and when they happen. Our view, therefore, is that the community-based interventions should not be ignored. They have potential for being a vehicle for delivering social protection to the community and the opportunity for being scaled up. Our view in the country, therefore, is that these community-based schemes should be analyzed with a view of seeing how they can be linked up with the public social security schemes. Finally, these community schemes have challenges because of poor financing and sustainability. They lack trained human resource. They rely mainly on volunteers and untrained staff, and they lack legal status. Our view in conclusion, therefore, will be a mix of the contributory based schemes.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister Hukton, for being with us. So let me continue with some questions. So I would like to make a question now from Mrs. Damaris, okay? And the questions are coming from attendants as well. So concerning and also to Mrs. Damaris and also to the official of FKE. So concerning the NSSF Act of 2013, why is that it was highly opposed by the COTU and FKE to a point that it has never been fully implemented to date in terms of contributions? Yet it would have been an excellent opportunity for employees to save more and also to be gateway to access other benefits, and it was stipulated in the Act. So it is a question that came from the audience. So please, Dr. Damaris and the official of FTU, if you can, Stephanie, if you can help us in answering this quite briefly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. It's true that the National Social Security Fund Act was reviewed in 2013, and it's meant to include informal economy workers and also to increase our contribution rates. However, we had a challenge as workers representatives because at one time there was an attempt to exclude workers representatives in the governance structure of NSSF, and that we were opposed to. And secondly, we didn't have we felt reservations because we didn't have proper structures, and especially human capacity. By then, we didn't have a substantive CEO at the helm, and that made us to have reservations because we called for strengthening of governance structures and also human capacity at the fund. However, the last 1 year, or going to 2 years, we have seen some improvement. Workers are currently represented in the governance structure, and we have recruited a CEO, and we are on the course of recruiting more human capacity at the institution. And therefore, late last year, my organization and the workers' representatives lifted that case from the courts, and we are feeling it's time that that act be implemented fully for the benefit of workers. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. So the representative of FKE, may you answer this question, please?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefan.
Yes, thank you, Marcos. To add on what Damaris has said, one point that is important for us to note is social dialogue, that any new thing that we introduce, any proposal that comes into the market, we need to have social dialogue around it so that the workers, the employers, and the representatives of the state can be able to agree on it, and then it becomes easier in implementation. So there were challenges, some provisions in it that were not agreeable to both parties, and there was a feeling that there needs to be more social dialogue around that and agree on how they're going to be implemented, and that is happening, and we are hoping that at some point there is going to be an agreement and then it to be implemented. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. So the next question comes from the audience as well, so from Roxana Abud, and the question goes to Mr. Sabelo. So, Sabelo, you a very important challenge about exclusion of the informal economy workers from the tripartite arrangements. How do you see the inclusive social dialogue process? So, Sabelo, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcelo. We believe that for an inclusive approach, and also in line with the Agenda 2063 Aspiration 1, which enjoins all of us to come up with inclusive approaches, we see at a national level and practically the informal sector, or the informal workers that are in the formal sector could then have a voice within maybe the trade unions, so that when they come to a regional level and they come to a continental level, they already have a voice there, so that they are well represented, and their needs, specific needs for the informal sector, could then be incorporated into the broader discussion at a regional and continental level. Marcelo.
Okay, so thank you very much. The last question is to the Minister of Finance of Egypt, so Dr. Mohamed Maid. So the question that came from the audience, so what are the challenges facing the social insurance system after its independence from the Ministry of Social Solidarity. So please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm May Farid. I'm Assistant Minister of Finance from Egypt. And please, you may repeat the question, please?
Yes, for sure I can. So, what are the challenges facing the social insurance system after its independence from the Ministry of Social Solidarity?
Well, I don't think it's a challenge. I think it's a reform. It's a big reform, and the independence and the financial sustainability that they should have now, and the big investment portfolio that they should work on. This is the kind of I would say challenges, or as you have mentioned, or big cornerstones that they should focus on, I think.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Okay, thank you. I would like to thank you all for participating on this, all the ministers that participate. So Minister Hukutana from Uganda, also the entire speakers here. So Minister Gregoire Ovana of Cameroon, also Sabelo, the African Union representative, Dr. Joy from UNDP, Dr. Damaris, also Ms. Jacqueline, that is represented by Mr. Stefan Rayford. Thank you very much for being with us. Of course, the Minister, Dr. Mohamed Mait, and also the Minister Hukutana. So thank you very, very much. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we have to close this session now, but it's extremely interesting in showing the relevance of extension of coverage of Social Security to the entire society.